Imagine that we are in the year 1500. Forget the idea of an empty and untouched land. If you could fly over the coast of what we now call Brazil, you would see much more than forest. You would see villages spread along the coastline, cultivation areas opened in the forest, smoke rising from freshly prepared fields, and trails connecting different regions. It was not an urban civilization like the great cities of the Old World, but it was also not an empty void. At that time, millions of people lived in the territory we now call Brazil. Estimates vary, but probably between 2 and 5 million inhabitants occupied this region, and they did not form a single people. They were hundreds of different groups with their own languages, customs, and forms of organization. Peoples such as the Tupinambas, Tupiniquins, Aimores, Goitacazes, and many others dominated different regions. These societies had organization. Many villages were built in circular or semicircular shapes, with a large central plaza where rituals, political decisions, and collective life took place. The houses, called malocas, were large structures made of wood and straw capable of housing several families. But perhaps the most impressive aspect was not in the buildings, but in the soil. Much of the Amazon is naturally poor soil. Even so, these peoples developed over generations techniques that we now know as Amazonian dark earth, creating extremely fertile areas that remain productive to this day. In addition, in several regions, especially in the Amazon, indigenous peoples did not just occupy the forest, they managed it, encouraging the growth of useful species and making the environment more productive over time. The basis of their diet included cassava, corn, beans, fruits, and hunting. It was an efficient diet adapted to the environment. And yes, there was war. Many of these peoples lived in conflict with each other, whether over territory, revenge, or prestige. Battles were frequent, especially among coastal groups. Now, imagine the scene changing. At dawn, a group observes the horizon, and then something appears. Large ships with white sails emerge on the sea. They are the ships of the Portuguese expedition led by Pedro Álvares Cabral. The first contact is marked by curiosity and strangeness. On one side, peoples accustomed to the tropical climate with their bodies painted and adorned. On the other, Europeans covered in heavy clothes, metal, and leather. One of the earliest records of this encounter was made by Pedro Álvares Cabral, who described the local inhabitants as healthy, strong, and curious, and highlighted the cultural contrast between the two worlds. In the first moments, there is no war, there is exchange. Barter emerges as a practical form of interaction. The indigenous people quickly realized the value of European objects, mainly metal ones. But at that time, the territory was still not a priority for Portugal. The Portuguese crown's focus was on trade with the Indies, which was extremely profitable. The new land was seen as secondary, a place for occasional exploitation, not immediate occupation. And this exploitation had a clear target: Brazil wood. This tree, abundant along the coast, produced a red dye highly valued in Europe. It quickly became the first major resource to be exploited. But the Portuguese did not know the territory. They depended completely on the indigenous peoples. It was the indigenous people themselves who cut the trees, transported the logs, and made this activity possible in exchange for tools and objects. It was a relationship of mutual interest, at least in the beginning. To organize this exploitation, the Portuguese created trading posts along the coast. Small commercial stations used to store wood and facilitate its shipment to Europe. For decades, this exploitation remained concentrated on the coast. The interior remained practically unknown to Europeans. But this scenario began to change. Other European powers, especially France, began to dispute the territory and the Brazil wood trade. The French also established alliances with indigenous peoples, creating a new dynamic of power. These alliances quickly ceased to be only commercial. Conflicts began to arise. Indigenous peoples, allied with different Europeans, began to fight each other, now with access to new technologies. The Tupinambas, for example, aligned themselves with the French, while the Tupiniquins aligned with the Portuguese. The territory was becoming a space of dispute, not only between Europeans, but between alliances formed within indigenous reality itself. And to maintain these alliances, something fundamental emerged: kinship. In many indigenous societies, alliances were strengthened by family ties. Leaders offered their daughters in marriage to Europeans as a way of creating lasting bonds. By accepting, the foreigner became part of the community, assuming obligations and duties. Cases such as those of João Ramalho and Diogo Álvares Correa show how these ties were decisive. These men integrated into indigenous societies, learned their languages, and became intermediaries between two worlds. But over time, this balance began to disappear. What began as exchange and cooperation evolved into control and exploitation. The Portuguese began to demand more and more labor. The cutting and transport of Brazil wood, which had previously taken place through exchange, began to turn into imposition. In several regions, indigenous people began to be captured and forced to work. Expeditions were organized to invade villages, imprison people, and use them as labor. This practice became known as indigenous enslavement. Men were forced to work in wood cutting and other heavy activities. Women and children were also taken, often separated from their families. Entire communities were destabilized. In some cases, conflicts between indigenous peoples were encouraged or exploited to capture prisoners, who were later used as forced laborers. What had once been a relationship of mutual interest was slowly turning into a system of domination. And while this exploitation advanced, another even more devastating factor began to spread: silent, invisible, and impossible to contain. Diseases. Flu, smallpox, and measles spread rapidly among populations that had no immunity whatsoever. The impact was devastating. In just a few decades, many communities were drastically reduced. Social structures collapsed. Entire peoples disappeared or were displaced. But the transformation was not only physical, it was also cultural. Along with the explorers came religious missionaries, determined to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. For them, it was not only about faith, it was also a way of reorganizing society. Gradually, the so-called missions emerged. In these places, indigenous people were gathered, catechized, and taught to live according to European customs. Languages, beliefs, and traditions began to be replaced. In many cases, indigenous religious practices were prohibited. For some, this represented protection against enslavement. For others, it was another form of control. Meanwhile, the Portuguese presence ceased to be temporary. What were once only trading posts and exchange points began to give way to permanent settlements. In 1532, the village of São Vicente was founded, considered the first stable Portuguese settlement in the territory. From that moment on, the European presence ceased to be only exploitation and became colonization. Over time, economic interest also changed. Brazil wood, which had been the main resource in the first decades, began to lose importance. Other activities, such as agriculture and especially sugarcane, began to gain space, and occupation became increasingly permanent along the coast. But the interior still held mysteries. For a long time, it remained little explored by Europeans, until centuries later, new expeditions began to advance further and further into the territory. At that time, indigenous peoples were already deeply impacted by diseases, conflicts, enslavement, and forced displacement. And it was in this scenario that a new motivation emerged: gold. And it was the search for gold pushing Europeans ever further into the interior of this territory that transformed the exploitation of resources into a process that, centuries later, would give rise to what we now call Brazil.